Oh, yeah, good evening everybody. I'm Cam Henderson. All my sins have been the Federated Farmers representative on the Waka steering group as it's been developed over the last year or two. Emissions reductions, there's sort of two components to it, and I guess the two have been a little bit confused, and probably rightly so. There's two parts to emissions reductions. First is the target, so that's where do we want to go. That's the emissions reductions targets, which does get a lot of airtime in the media. And then the second part is, well, how do we get there? So regardless of what the target is, what is the mechanism to get to that final destination? And He Waka is all about how we get to that destination. It's not the destination itself. And it's quite easy to sort of use the two of them in the same conversation, but they are both in legislation and in I guess the organisation of He Waka are very, very separate conversations. We haven't touched that first element within He Waka. There's been no agreement around targets. Most partners disagree with the targets. Our focus has been on how do we get to whatever targets have to be in legislation. So I'll quickly just go through, for those that may not have heard, I'll very quickly sort of go through what He Waka is recommending, and then we can go into some more of the nitty-gritty bits and pieces. So why does He Waka exist? Well, the Labor government got elected back in, whenever it was, 2017, I think it was, on putting agriculture into the ETS. That was the plan. 2019, we saw the Zero Carbon Act come along. As part of that Carbon Act, the one big win that Ag had was that we had split gas targets. So those are the 10% reduction by 2030 and 24 to 47 by 2050. That is quite world leading and having a different target for methane. The government wanted Ag in the ETS. Ag leaders came together and said, no, that's a really bad idea. ETS isn't split gas. It only works at processing level, not farm level. And that's where He Waka was born, around trying to design a system that's better than the ETS for pricing ag emissions. Now, why is ETS so bad? Essentially, you get charged a fixed price per unit of output, so it'll be so many cents per kg milk solid or so many cents per kilo of meat, a bit like your levy is at the moment. And to put some numbers around that, this is some modelling that came out of He Waka. So in 2025, if the carbon price was $85 a tonne, and we had 95% free allocation. A free allocation is basically a discount the government applies to various industries to make sure they remain competitive. So the current legislation says we get a 95% discount. The price for dairy farmers would be 5 cents per kg milk solid. By 2030, carbon price goes to $135 a tonne. That free allocation reduces over time. All free allocation reduces over time. The price would be about 16 cents per kg milk solid. Now that doesn't look too bad on the face of it, especially when you're getting a $9 payout. But the politics around all those numbers is changing pretty quickly. So the carbon price is already $85 a tonne. It's actually above that now, and we're only in 2022. There's talk in 2025 of it getting to $200 a tonne. There's also politics around the free allocation part too. The Labor government really wants to get rid of it altogether within agriculture, or reduce it very, very quickly. So if you start increasing the price per kilo of carbon, tonne of carbon, reduce the free allocation, you can see the numbers can get pretty scary. So at $135 a tonne for carbon, and no free allocation at all, you're talking $1.30 per kg milk solids, or for a 700 cow farm, somewhere around about $500,000. What happens to that money? It disappears into the ether. So at the moment it just goes into the government funding pool. You might have heard the ACT Party recently said that during the economic crisis some of that money should get pulled out and shoved back into the economy through whatever means. But at the moment it just disappears into the government coffers. Doesn't go back into ag, doesn't go back into R&D, it just disappears. So you can see why it's such a poor option for farmers. And ultimately, because it's being charged on a per kilo of unit output, like per milk solid, arguably the only way to escape that is to produce less. So very quickly, what was He Waka recommending? Essentially, they were going to set up a committee that would have independent agricultural people on it. What that means, we're not entirely sure yet. They would set a separate price for methane, nitrous oxide, carbon sequestration, so it wouldn't be market-based at all, it would all be set by committee. The pricing will be set based on those 5 factors that you can see there. So there's a number of goals that they're trying to achieve, I guess, out of that pricing. Farmers would then report their emissions through an online calculator and pay the levy based on what they've calculated and the prices that exist at that particular time. And then farmers would also get discounts for applying certain mitigations. So it might be we actually don't have many at the moment, low methane genetics, coated urea. As and when they become available, there'll be subsidies to try and encourage farmers to pick up those mitigations. And then yes, carbon sequestration as well. So you can use your carbon sequestration to offset your, some carbon sequestration, not all of it, to offset your emissions charge. One of the key parts of this, and it's been universal throughout the entire conversation, is that all the money would go back to agriculture. So first it needs to pay for the admin of the system, because obviously, well, like overseas, you've got software charges and the running of the system itself. But the majority would go into R&D and further on-farm incentives to try and encourage farmers to do new things, whatever it might be, to reduce emissions. Now, I guess, stepping back and probably putting some of my own opinion on this, arguably what we've come up with is the best of a bad bunch. There was no perfect solution out of this. We're not 100% happy with it. I don't think anybody is. There's some positives out of what we're proposing. There's definitely some negatives out of it as well. But at this stage, it is the one option that's got the support of all the partners in the group. And so that's the one that we've come up with. We, I say, is not feds, we as in Waka. So I guess some of the key positives are it applies at farm level. So you can control, essentially, if you emit more, you pay more. If you emit less, you pay less. Whereas with ETS, it didn't really matter. You paid anyway. It uses separate pricing for short and long lived gases, which is really critical for ag. It offers incentives for certain actions, but those actions are set by a committee. And probably really importantly for the dairy and beef and lamb to be involved was that there was no grandparenting and there was no baselines, no starting points at all. We know how messy that got with nutrients and water. Big cons is pretty socialist, arguably. The committee basically controls everything, controls the pricing, controls the incentives, controls the mitigations that it's going to incentivise. And farmers really only get small reward for improvements. So if you're a farmer and you drop your emissions by, say, 10%, so you do your fair share of the emissions reductions, you still pay the methane price, emissions price on those remaining emissions until the entire industry catches up to you. So if you, in year one, you could drop your emissions by 10%, which is what the government's asking us to do by 2030, but you continue to pay the fee on your remaining 90% of your emissions until the entire industry has also done the same thing. And that's one of the parts of the farmer that I'm quite unhappy about, because it really disincentivises people taking action early on. Essentially, we all pay until no one pays. And the government wants final say on everything. So while the committee might set the price, the government and the ministers would still have to rubber stamp it, and politics of the day could mean that they do what they like with the pricing as well. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about targets. So while it's not in the He Waka Reke Noa mandate, and even if He Waka had decided to put an opinion in there about the targets, the government basically said we're going to completely ignore anything you write about targets. So we could have talked about tax policy or international trade. I mean, it wouldn't have mattered because the government was going to ignore it. But there is a process in 2024 where those targets are being reviewed. So in legislation, they need to be reviewed in 2024. I guess that in the discussions that we've had in the steering group, because we've had a lot of experts come and present and a lot of farmer feedback, is that ag really isn't ready for that discussion yet. And there's a couple of elements there that create complexity in that targets discussion that ag really needs to wrap its head around if it's going to be really well prepared for 2024. So the top two there, the first one is that actually the ultimate goal of all of this process is to limit warming to 1.5 degrees. That's the Paris climate change target. So while we're really focused on net zero, and if we go below net zero, we need to be compensated for it. that's how the ETS works and what the current legislation in our country says, but arguably the global goal is limiting warming to 1.5 degrees. And so if you were to take, in a hypothetical scenario, if it was much cheaper for agriculture to reduce its emissions beyond net zero to get there versus another industry, then that's a solution that really needs to be looked at to meet that ultimate goal. The question then becomes compensation. So if one industry is having to do more than another, how does that compensation work? And that's the complexity. So as part of that 1.5 degree warming, there's two elements. So there's the future warming, and everyone's probably heard about GWP star. There's been a lot of articles written about it, around how we measure agriculture's warming effect on the climate going forward. And that's much more advanced in New Zealand than it is anywhere else in the world. It's a relatively complex argument around the life of methane and the fact that it degrades naturally. And New Zealand and Ireland and a few other pasture-based countries in South America have got a really strong incentive to try and introduce this science into international targets because it really benefits our system. The challenges, so the GWP really only deals with future warming. It doesn't talk about what is the warming we've had previously, and that's the element that we've been warned ag really needs to get a real grip on. So GWP star, if you want to take the most common current understanding of it, is that if we reduce our methane, agriculture reduces its methane by 0.3% per year, that's essentially net zero from a methane perspective. What it doesn't take into account is what that starting point was. So you could say, like, if tomorrow or this year, if agriculture doubled its emissions in 1 year, but then started reducing that by 0.3% a year, technically it's net zero. But it doesn't. That GWP then doesn't account for the fact that we've doubled it the year prior. So what ag needs to do is look back and say, well, and the current science that we're seeing is that even if we get to net zero 2050 with all other industries and ag hits its current targets in the legislation, ag will still be the largest contributor to the warming effect that New Zealand has had so far, by well over 50%. So that's the challenge is, are we being grandparented in because of our historic emissions profile, and how do we create an argument, that is scientifically accurate but is also not detrimental to agriculture to account for that.
I wanted to move on, Kim.
Yeah, sorry.
That's right.
Yeah.
Cam will be here all night. Chewers here in the back corner.